Hi, Megan. We're still waiting for Zach here. We're live. Welcome.
Okay, thank you. I was just going to let everybody know that we have a show happening. So there we go.
We are here, and we're excited to talk to Zach. Hopefully, he'll find his way back over here. We were just meeting in another virtual space. So
very excited to be here.
And I'm going to post it.
Susan, what have you been up to while we're waiting here?
I am really excited as the end of the year comes, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about it. And I see Zach; he just entered the studio, but
Nice.
So let's bring him in to our conversation.
Great,
awesome.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Awakening Educator. I'm Susan Andrian,
and I'm Megan Sweet.
And Megan, you want to introduce our guest?
I'm very excited to introduce Zach Westerbeck, who is going to be talking to us all about mental health and his journey towards getting there. So Zach, welcome to the show, and be actually great for you to introduce yourself a little bit more, a little bit about who you are and what you are passionate about.
Yes, thank you, Megan and Susan, for inviting me to the show. It's great to be here. I am a mental health advocate. I'm a professional speaker. I'm a mental health coach, and then the author of the mental health book, You're Not Alone, which is a guide for 18 to 24-year-olds to overcome anxiety and depression. And the catalyst really to start this journey, because honestly, my background was in technology in corporate America, like one of the many machines that shows up every day and just does his role inside of the just the cog inside of the machine. But the catalyst for me was actually the onset of a brain disorder in early 2016. And I don't know how much of that story you want me to get into right now, but that's kind of what sent me down this path. So what initially started as just feeling like I was fighting for my survival in 2016, 2017, kind of turned into what is now my full-time career, just advocating and getting the message out amongst high school students, college students, and then a little bit of work in the corporate space as well, shining a light, destigmatizing and normalizing mental health.
I'm so excited that you're here. As you were talking, you actually made me think about a friend of mine who killed himself right when we were in that same age range. So I think it's a really tricky age range in particular. And he was somebody who, I had this like major crush on him in high school, and just was like a really good friend and seemed always really happy and like everything was good. And then got through college, and it's that, I think often actually the tricky part is going to college can be hard and challenging for some youth. And I think that's really important, but also it's like, okay, now that college is over, now what? And there's a sudden like feeling that you can just kind of be dropped out of the world. And there's just a lot of pressure suddenly when you're still really young. So I think the age range that you're focusing on is really important. I'm excited to talk to you about that. And I imagine your work has done nothing but uptick in the last couple of years because the pandemic has created a lot of stress.
Yes.
So maybe you could tell a little bit more about your story. How did this become your passion versus something else? So how did this become so important?
Yeah. Thank you, Megan. And I will say you're absolutely right on both fronts. I really wanted to target that 18 to 24-year-old range because they say that about 75% of individuals who are going to experience the onset of a brain disorder, that are going to experience some sort of mental health challenge, stress, overwhelm, burnout, anxiety, depression, thoughts of suicide, it's going to happen between 18 to 24. And I fit perfectly into that statistic. I was 23 when I started to experience those symptoms and hadn't been educated at all. I was starting from the ground, just ground level, trying to build up, trying to understand what was going on inside of my brain. And then, with the pandemic, there's been a huge increase in suicides amongst young adults. So it's definitely a relevant, important topic. And I think from my work, my story is very relatable because I went on to, when I graduated from high school, went on to attend Purdue University. And like, just to show you just how much mental health and going down this path was not on my radar. I graduated with a degree in economics. So I thought that I was going to go down the technology business path, because when I graduated, I moved down to Raleigh, North Carolina to start working for the technology company Cisco Systems. So I'm down there, I'm in their early in career program, and everything is amazing for about the first 10 months. It's this built-in program. And I think, Megan, you kind of alluded to this, like that transition into college and then that transition out of college. They're these transitional time periods. And it's like, you're trying to figure out, who am I? What is my identity? What do I want to stand for? What does the next phase of my life look like? And for me, it kind of felt like it was built in. Like I moved down there, I had a new set of friends. There was 30 or 40 of us going through this training program together. So I felt good. Like I had a friend group, all the things, connection, a purpose, a direction. But then right at around that 10-month mark, things started to change with the way that my brain functioned. And then, so now all of a sudden I'm waking up with sweaty palms, dry mouth, racing thoughts, and a pounding heart in my chest, like waking up before work. Like, why is every part of my body activated right now? Why am I having these intrusive thoughts that the harder I try to stop them, the worse that they get? And so I sort of just decided, you know what, I'm going to put together a little plan. 2016 is right around the corner. At that point in time, I was reading a lot of personal development. So I was like, going to start up a New Year's resolution. My only goal for 2016 is to flip my brain back to the way that it used to be. In my mind, my brain was like a light switch, something that had just been turned on. And if I could just flip it back to the way that it used to be, I could get on with my life. That was kind of the plan that I was clinging to. And really the way that I was going to do that was go to work, go to the gym, sit in the steam room, sweat out all the toxins in my body. That was, I just needed to do a detox, right? Just like somebody might do a detox before a vacation or whatever it might be. Just cleanse the system. It'll kind of cleanse my brain, and we can go back to business as usual. And so I did that plan. I executed on it flawlessly for 31 days. The only challenge is that I didn't get the results that I was looking for. And not only had the symptoms I just told you two about get worse and intensify, that I now know was and is severe anxiety, but a second symptom had crept in, and that was depression. And at that time, I had a very, I would say, stigmatized view of what it meant to have mental health, what it meant to, struggle with depression, anxiety, kind of that old idea that this is a choice. You can snap out of it. You can easily fix these things. Stop being sad, right? Just go do things that make you happy. And so now my whole world is getting turned upside down, because that was essentially the plan, right? Go do these things and it'll flip your brain back and you'll be good to go. But instead, now in a matter of a couple of months, I've gone from this happy-go-lucky kid, right, 23, like we were talking about, to this extremely anxious, deeply depressed individual with no answers as to what was happening. And so I go into full-blown panic mode. And over the course of the next couple of months, I kind of call this the Zach's Home Remedies time period, because I was just trying all these different things that I thought would flip my brain back. And I was really doing two things well during this time period. The first thing I was doing, I was hiding from the outside world what I was experiencing internally. Literally nobody knew. None of my colleagues from work, my family members, my now wife, my friends. Like, I was hiding it from everyone because I didn't know what was going on with my brain.
Right.
The second thing that I was doing is I was denying to myself just how quickly my brain health was deteriorating. And within a couple more months, a third symptom had crept in, and that was thoughts of suicide. And initially it was kind of like, sprinkled in throughout the day. And it was a very much so like, meet this with very strong resistance. Like, I love to live. I love life. There's no way that I would ever act on these thoughts. But at my lowest point in time, I was having thoughts of suicide from the moment I woke up until the moment I went to bed. So Eyes open,
Mm.
thoughts of suicide. I'm in the bathroom preparing to go to work, thoughts of suicide. I'm driving in traffic to get to work, thoughts of suicide. I'm in a meeting, right, with managers, stakeholders, people that are important to furthering my career. I want to care about what's going on in the meeting, and I have thoughts populating in my head telling me that I should just go kill myself.
Mm.
And so everything kind of came to a head one night where essentially I hit my rock bottom moment. I thought 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road. And at that time, and for people who struggle with anxiety and depression, they know it's physically painful. It's psychologically painful, but it's physically, it pays a toll on your body. And I was just beat down. I was exhausted. I was fatigued. I was completely hopeless.
Right.
And I just, like I said, I just thought if this is life, if this is what it's going to feel like, I just kind of pictured almost just kind of trudging through for the next 20 years. It wasn't what I signed up for. This wasn't how I was going to spend the rest of my life. And so I decided, you know what, before I take any action, let me confide in somebody. I mean, you're not just going to suffer in silence and not tell someone. At least throw up a Hail Mary, see if somebody has an idea. And so I reached out to my parents, and what they did for me is what I now do, traveling the country, speaking to thousands of students across the U.S. And it's very simple. They didn't judge me, and they encouraged me to seek professional assistance. And of course, at that time, this was kind of like a revolutionary idea. Like, I should go talk to somebody about what's going on inside of my head. And I ended up pairing up with a psychologist who specialized in what I was struggling with. And in late 2016, I was diagnosed with a chronic brain disorder known as OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder, where the core symptoms are severe anxiety, deep depression, and thoughts of suicide. And so I immediately started talk therapy specific to OCD. And over the course of the next couple of years, through talk therapy, lifestyle changes, and mindset shifts, I was able to get back to a place where I just felt really, really passionate about making sure that other people didn't suffer in silence. And that's why the title of my book is You're Not Alone, because I felt like, of course, these conversations just weren't happening in 2016. So I felt like I was on an island, and I talk about this in the book, but I still remember the first time I discovered that actually one of my colleagues that I work with, that she had OCD. And it was the first time that I realized, oh, wow, like, I'm not alone in this journey. And it was like 1,000,000 pounds lifted off my shoulders. And there was still a lot that needed to happen. There was a long road ahead for me to get back to where I'm at now. But just that relief of knowing that, okay, I'm not weak, weird, or different, I'm human, for experiencing this was kind of what gave me the hope to push forward and then ultimately get into this line of work.
That's quite a journey. And I'm really grateful that you had your parents to be able to go, and that they were able to show up in that way, in that moment, and knew how to listen and support you. And I think one of the things around suicide and suicide prevention, that often we think if we speak it out loud, we're going to make it happen. If we, like, I think people are afraid to ask, or, do you have thoughts of suicide? And we know actually that asking and using the words and talking about it directly is one of the ways that we prevent people from actually committing suicide.
Yes.
So I'm so grateful that you did that. And I'm so grateful your parents were there to be able to support you in that way. And I think as we, there's so many areas that I want to dive into. I'm curious about the talk therapy piece, because as someone who started in the field as a therapist in 2000, so it's funny to me when you say, oh, no one was talking about this in 2016. And I think no one's talking about it until we start talking about it. And there's pockets.
Right.
And right now there are pockets where people don't know. And then there are other pockets where we've been talking about it forever. And it's just that lens of where we're at in the moment in our lives and and it's like the veil comes off. Right. Yeah. And once the veil is removed and you see everywhere that we're all struggling in some ways with our health and mental health, and that it's not just in your thinking either. It lives completely, entirely in your body and physically in our body. And so we need the wellness practices and the prevention practices. And then we also need to know how to show up for people who are in deep and critical pain in the moment. So I do want to talk more about talk therapy, because I'm not anti-talk therapy, but I, basing my work on Dr. Bruce Perry's work and looking at sequencing interventions, and that starting from the body, and then by the time we get to talk therapy, that's really the thinking part of the brain. And a lot of times the work is, so much of the work for folks isn't in the thinking part of the brain. It's in it's in other parts of the brain and other parts of the body. And so we need the knowledge, but then we also need these tools to interrupt what's happening physiologically in our system as we're experiencing that psychological pain, and then to translate that into schools now. So I'm excited to talk about mental health first aid in your book, because I do think that all teachers, just like basic instruction, they should also be, all of our teachers, especially middle and high school, and now after the pandemic, I would say all elementary school teachers as well, should be trained in mental health first aid, so that they have an understanding of how to show up and be that person that your parents happen to be at that time.
Well, I'd add college professors to the mix as well. I think that, one of the things that is true through the pandemic, and I'm sure you've seen this, Zach, and I know Susan and I have, is, right, well, there were pockets of people who understood that mental health and well-being were important. As somebody myself professionally who's tried to get educators to practice mindfulness and self-care for many, many years, wrote a book about it pre-pandemic. Most people kind of blew it off, like, whatever. And now they're seeing how important our mental health and well-being is. And suddenly there's this huge urgency for us to address it in schools. And we have a whole group of kids that are moving into, she gets here, moving into the world, who have had such profound and painful experiences that are going into the age range that you're talking about. I'm a principal at a high school right now, and mental health and well-being is a daily concept for us to be paying attention to. And I'm watching what's happened to kids that have had so much of their formative years being influenced by being in a pandemic. And the outcome of that is going to be years to come. So it doesn't actually even matter what age the kids are. We're going to be feeling this for a long time. And I try and talk with folks about that a lot. Like, look, we're going back to somewhat normal. We're taking off our masks in a lot of places. Schools are back in session. But actually, the effects of this pandemic are going to be with us for years and years to come. And so I'm wondering, what are some of the things that you talk with your, what are some of the things you talk or share in your speeches around the country? And what are some of the things that you advocate for there?
Yeah, that's a great question, Megan. And I will say to Susan's point too, mentioning the fact that talking about suicide or bringing it up and creating that safe space doesn't plant a new, like, that seed into somebody's head of like, okay, they weren't thinking of it. Like, if I don't bring it up, they're not going to think about suicide as an option. And I think that is such a critical point, Susan, that you touched on, and it needs to be, people need to understand that, because from that training, right, the mental health first aid certification, you learn that. But then from lived experience on my end, when I was experiencing thoughts of suicide, all I wanted was for somebody to ask me, Zach, how are you doing? Are you experiencing thoughts of suicide? If so, tell me about them. And back then, and my wife and I have talked about this, and she's very educated. She's an advocate in the space now as well. But back then, she thought that if she didn't bring anything up, that I would forget, right? Like, hey, if I don't bring up the depression, if I don't bring up the anxiety, if I don't bring up the thoughts of suicide, he'll forget. And if he forgets, then it's like he doesn't have it. And so I had to explain to her that no, it's there. It's with me everywhere I go, actually. And if you could give me that safe space, it would be really helpful, because it wouldn't feel like I was bringing it up proactively all the time and kind of quote unquote maybe putting that burden on you, but instead it was like you taking an interest in that. So I think that that's a really, really good point, Susan, that you brought up. And yeah, I would be happy to talk about therapy too. But Megan, to your question, my core mental health programming, which is focused for high schoolers and college students, and then now really starting to tailor a program for corporations as well, is really centered around three core areas. And these were kind of the areas that I saw like, all right, if we're going to destigmatize and normalize mental health in society, and like you said, get it outside of just these pockets, and really kind of make this information mainstream, there's three core areas that I think we have to hit. The first of which is that destigmatizing and normalizing. So in the workshop, we debunk a lot of the mental health myths and messaging that we've all received over the course of our lifetime, right? So kind of that, things will get better in time. Just think happy thoughts, right? Like those kind of comments that a lot of us will receive throughout our lifetime. Some of that messaging that gets ingrained inside of us. And then we start to shift our perspective on what it actually means to have mental health, or what I call brain health. And I use the term brain health in my programs as a destigmatizing tool, because we don't call our heart health soul health. We call it heart health because it's a tangible organ in the body, and there are actions that we can take to improve its functionality and decrease the likelihood that you experience heart disease, right, et cetera. It's the exact same thing with our brains. And I would argue that after going through an experience where I felt completely out of control with my emotions and my cognitive functioning, I would argue that our brains are the most important organ in our bodies. And just like our hearts, there are actions that we can take to improve its functionality and decrease symptoms of anxiety, depression, thoughts of suicide. We can actually heal our brains.
So we are up on a break already. We're coming up, and so I want to go into this a little bit further. I know we have I want you to get to your core concepts, but I also want to be thinking about this, our heart and our brains, because I see them as actually very, they're all connected and as a whole body. So, and where our overlap is, and then how do we start to think about? Because I think of mental health as health physically, emotionally, cognitively, spiritually, like they're all really sort of holistic.
Yep.
And the brain is our central command, right? So as that key piece. So we're going to go take a quick break, very short. Like for those of you watching us live on Facebook, we're going to go off. We're going to come right back on, but this is for our later break spaces. And we're back. That's all, Joe's
the world's fastest break.
Okay,
do you want to bring us in, Megan?
Welcome back, everyone. We're talking with Zach Westerbeck, and when we were going away on break, Susan named that one of the things we want to explore is what is the connection between our brains and our hearts and our bodies, and how they fit together, and how can we start to address this. Zach, you were saying that that we can heal our brains, which we'd love to hear more about. And, definitely Susan and I are in the brain heart. I'm in the brain heart gut integration world. Oh, yeah. So, and Susan is too. So like, also, how can you then start to bring those pieces together? Because I would argue that a lot of the issues that we have is that we're so stuck on our brains that we actually forget to get back into our bodies, listen to our hearts, listen to our guts, and just slow things down a bit. That's not the cure for depression and suicide. So I want to be very clear. Yeah. However, I think for a lot of, I know for me, when I go through my day, when I'm just stuck in my head, I can be incredibly unhappy. So, and I miss a lot of really important details, which is what I wrote my book about. So anyway, why don't you tell us a little bit more about what your framework is for how you start to heal the brain, and then I'm sure we'll jump in with our thoughts because we can't help ourselves. So.
Yeah, no, of course. And Megan, you've touched on this numerous times. And so I'll say that, like, in addition to looking at myself as a mental health advocate, I'm completely and fully a mindfulness and meditation advocate as well. And you two having, bringing that mental health perspective paired with that educator perspective, I fully believe that mindfulness and meditation skills should be taught at every level of schooling, K through 12. And then, theoretically at that point, you could have it in the collegiate space as required learning. But by that point in time, for anybody who understands mindfulness and meditation at kind of that experience level, understands that it transforms you as a human being.
Right.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, to your point, you all, and Susan, I love your emphasis on the brain body connection. I know, Megan, you touched on that too. And what we're talking about is wellness. That's what we're talking about. And I think historically speaking, it was really approached, brain and body were siloed. And it was like, okay, we just address the brain, or we just address the body. And health and wellness extend well beyond just the brain and the body. It's everything that you talked about. It's spirituality, it's the environment, it's understanding trauma and the impact that can have over time. It's understanding our family dynamic and the culture that we grow up in. And then I know that, Susan, you were talking about nature as a tool as well. And there are so many natural healing modalities out there outside of just the traditional medication first route. And I'm not anti-medication, but just saying it's not the only route that you can take. It can be a part of a holistic plan that you put together. And what I call my brain health blueprint is taking all of those components and mixing them into what works for the individual. For me, at my level, I work a very strict morning and night routine that involves waking up, drinking a glass of water, going to the gym and exercising for 45 minutes to an hour, followed by a 10 to 15 minute meditation. And then I jump into my day. And then I like to spend in my evening routine some time reading and then meditating again. And then having those incremental breaks throughout the day to get outside as a part of managing stress, overwhelm, anxiety. Where I think therapy can be really, really effective is in those more extreme situations. Like I was trying to go outside and take walks in nature when I was experiencing severe anxiety, intrusive thoughts, OCD symptoms. One of the core symptoms of OCD specifically is intrusive thoughts. So I was trying all of the things, right? I was meditating, I was exercising, I was getting out into nature, I was connecting with friends, right? Getting that oxytocin, the release of oxytocin, which it's a feel-good chemical for the brain that we get when we're connecting with others. I was doing all of the things, but I was missing that therapeutic approach that I needed in the short term to teach me some of those cognitive skills that I could carry with myself, and then mix that in conjunction with some of the lifestyle behaviors that we were just talking about.
Yeah. And as I said, I think cognitive therapy can be a really important and valuable intervention. And the way that the neurosequential model looks at it, or Dr. Perry's, is this regulate, relate, reason. And so depending on where in the brain your lagging skill is, or the problem sort of resides, is where you focus the treatment. And so when we look at things like very early developmental trauma, where kids are not having the caregiving needs met at a very early age, often where those traumas, those preverbal traumas, live are in the non-preverbal parts of the brain and the body, and their ability to regulate. And so cognitive therapy doesn't work very well for a client who's got these traumas that are sort of residing in the lower part of the brain. But if you're mostly have a pretty well organized brain, except for you're having these thoughts that are intrusive and won't stop, cognitive behavioral therapy can be very helpful in interrupting those intrusive thoughts, because the place where you're struggling is living in the executive functioning thinking part of the brain. Right. And so it's targeting that part of the brain to be able to support it.
Yes. And was it Bruce Perry who did the book with Oprah?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so I've read that book.
Yes.
It's a very approachable read. And I love it's conversational. I love the back and forth. And
Mhm.
it really just and I don't want to get too off topic, but it really did emphasize for me how important early childhood development is, and
Mhm.
how so many people in society are playing from behind,
Mhm.
which we know, but like at the brain level, like at the deepest level possible,
Yeah.
are playing from behind because they didn't receive the type of love and care that you need early on
Mhm.
to develop and function properly. And it's been a little while since I've read the book, but I just distinctly remember that sticking out, and really, because I think the title of the book was like, "What Happened to You?"
Yes. That's the title.
And almost as an advocate, right? Like when I walk into a room, I know that there's somebody in the room that's overwhelmed, somebody in the room who's anxious, somebody in the room who's dealing with depression, somebody in the room who's dealing with some form of trauma. So it's just looking at that advocacy through a different lens to understand, like, okay, what have people been through that is informing their decisions and their behavior
Mhm.
and how they
Mhm.
operate in the world. So
Mhm.
I'm glad that you brought that up.
Yeah, we were fortunate enough to have Bruce Perry on our show here, which was pretty cool.
Very
And
cool.
and yeah, it's something that Susan and I emphasize a lot, and I'm grateful that you're naming it too. And I think we need to just keep having people talk about it and figure out how they can link in. One of the things that I talk a lot about in my book, and that I focus a lot around with educators, is super important what happens with your family of origin. And
Mhm.
also, we as adults that are working in school with kids have a profound impact on kids and their sense of self and their sense of what they are able to do and realize
Mm,
for themselves as adults.
Mhm.
So we have to
Mhm.
be incredibly mindful about how we talk to kids about kids, and how we get what kind of agency or confidence or lack of confidence we give to kids, and why
Mhm.
things like systemic racism and white supremacy are so detrimental to our society, not only because of all the ways that we can see it looking like in the world, lack of access to opportunity. We only need to look at the Supreme Court nomination process going on right now to see it on full display. Um, but also because of what it does to children's sense of what they are able to do and what their capacity is, and how we have villainized so many people in our culture for surely just being who they are, particularly African American boys. The impact on how they're seen and treated in our education system has a profound impact on what their sense of possibility is as adults. So I think there's the mental health part, but there's also just the let's be careful how we talk to in and around
Mhm.
and believe kids. And I think all of the modalities that you're talking about, and this is a bird walk, but now I'm on it, so I'm going to keep going for a minute, is in those modalities that you're talking about also help us to get a handle on what we're thinking and feeling, which I imagine is a part of the challenge that comes
Mhm.
up when we're starting to have these mental health issues, is we're not always aware of the shift.
Mhm.
But when we start to become more mindful and more self-aware, then we can start to see and start to grapple with what's there. So I just wanted to put all that out there.
Yeah,
yes.
I'd like to add on to that a little bit around the state dependent. So one of the key concepts of Dr. Perry's work, and I think you touched on this, Zach, is the state dependent functioning, right? So that we are functioning based on what state we're in. So if we're in a
Mhm.
state of heightened distress, or we're in a state, if we're hyper aroused, or we're dissociative, which is the other end of that continuum,
Right.
if we're in that state, our the blood stops flowing to the prefrontal cortex, we become our it shrinks into different parts. So our functioning when we're in that state of distress is actually really diminished, and so our
Mhm.
decision making goes down. Our what we believe and value sometimes isn't accessible to us in that moment, and so
Mhm.
we start making decisions and behave in ways that are not aligned with our values, because we're not fully in our bodies and our brains. And then the other piece of that, and I'm curious what you're thinking around this, is that relief from distress is one of the biggest rewards we can experience, right? Physiologically, if we're in distress, if we're in physical or emotional pain,
Right.
and we do something and it relieves that physical or emotional pain, that is a very rewarding experience, which is why eating, drinking alcohol, doing drugs, sex addiction, all these addictions, all these ways in which we temporarily relieve emotional and physical distress, but then create these harmful loops that cause us to be further and further in these spaces. And we're seeing it right now play out in schools. We're seeing it play out in our culture, in our community, as we're at a greater sense of distress. People are falling into some of these traps.
Yeah, and I think you touched on it too, right? That the kind of the CEO of the brain shuts down when you're in that, when you're experiencing that stress response, which really creates that disadvantage. So I completely agree with you on that. And Megan, you touched on agency and confidence, and I think those are, I mean, if you look at anybody who's been successful in life, they have those two components. They believe that they can make things happen. There's this self-confidence, and it does come from oftentimes that external messaging that you receive. And oftentimes some of that messaging isn't happening in the household. So how can the school system become a place that cultivates that agency and confidence? And I do believe, having gone to a school that was half white, half black, growing up, what I saw was there wasn't, okay, so if you come from a family where there's a lot of historical trauma, obviously we can all agree that there's systemic racism at play and ripple effects that has. And then there's scarcity in the home front. There's food scarcity. There's in a lot of cases, sometimes abuse taking place in the household. And then you go to school and we kind of wonder why kids aren't interested in learning about history. And I think one thing that in reflecting on my experience where it was kind of lower income students, right, that the high school that I went to, is creating an environment in the school where there's topics that are relevant to the students with where they're at in life at that moment, and teaching life skills that they can take with them, teaching them financial literacy, things that might get them excited to say, hey, I can take these skills, and I can apply them in my life when I graduate from high school. And so I think that there needs to be a shift in K through 12, and maybe you two can touch on that a little bit more, where we are teaching more of like the life skills, the financial literacy, the mindfulness and meditation. And obviously, English class is still very important. Secondary language, math, sciences, history. I'm not saying get rid of them, but maybe incorporating some of those life skills too, where students can show up and learn how to create that agency and confidence for themselves.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think creating spaces where kids can develop their own agency is incredibly important. Helping students to start becoming aware of how they're feeling and what's going on, super urgent. And giving kids tools today, in particular, how to work with what's going on for them is really important. As you were telling your story, I was just reflecting on my experience over the last year, and I'm a fairly tough cookie. One of the things that I have used, one of my crutches I've used to lean on over the years, is just my own sense of ability to just get stuff done. Like, I'm a highly motivated person, Susan.
No, Megan, not you.
Not at all. And I'll just do, if I want to do something, I put my mind to it and I'll do it. And one of the effects I've had over the last couple of years is I lost that for a while. And I would say that what I hit was a depression, and I got this place of like total overwhelm at work. And, I'm in a space where I'm often responsible for other people and their emotions and their experiences, and just dealing with my own, and my go-to skill was gone. I just couldn't motivate to save my life. Like, I just couldn't do anything. And so I think this, like, our experiences of this moment in time can look really different as well. I didn't have some of the symptoms you're describing, but I did have some of the other ones. And I think it's just really important for us to start to acknowledge that that's there. And I was freaking out. And for a while, I was trying the same strategy as you were, which was like, all right, I'm just going to white knuckle it. I love that you named, like, you have a program and you created, like, that's, I have lists of that around my house right now. Actually, I'm like, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, and this is how I'm going to get my thought. But when you're really in that place, actually, that's really hard to do. And so when you're lacking motivation, giving yourself like a 5-step program that you're going to do during the day to get through to get through the problem that you're trying to get over, often that doesn't work. And I'm seeing that playing out in our schools a lot right now as well, where kids'
Absolutely.
sense of who they were pre-pandemic, and adults, our sense of
I would
who
say
we are
teachers and
pre-pandemic.
educators too, for sure.
Absolutely. Teachers and educators, we're all in this, like, this is who we used to be, but now we're who we are now. And we're, in schools. So we've got kids that are highly activated. They're different. They're trying to figure themselves out. We have the adults that are trying to figure themselves out. And the group that you're really focused on. And then now we're launching all these, like, people into the world that are, don't necessarily have the skills. So when we come back from break, what I'd love to do is to hear your thoughts about, again, what you bring out into the world when you talk to students and young adults about how to cope with that, what your thoughts are on that. And then we'd also love to, when we come back, hear a little bit more about how people can connect with you.
And if you're listening live, don't go anywhere. We're only going away for like 2 seconds. So stay with us.
2 seconds. We'll be right back.
Welcome back. We are in our last section together at The Awakening Educator. This has been such a rich conversation with Zach Westerbeck, and we'd like to take this last section of our time together to hear about your book, to hear about what you're doing, and to really think about what can we do as educators and community to really make sure that we are elevating wellness, we are identifying mental health concerns, and have some actionable items to be able to support in our schools.
Absolutely. And I think that gets back to kind of the education being taught in the school system that we were talking about. And that's the 3-pronged approach that I take. I think it's important for both at the educator level and then at the student level for there to be a deeper sense of awareness, which Megan's touched on a lot. And it sounds like you wrote about that in your book as well. So it all stems from that awareness piece. And so in my program, what we teach in the first section is that destigmatizing and normalizing, getting people to realize that we actually all sit on a brain health continuum, something that we fluctuate back and forth on based on numerous factors, right? Our genetics, the daily stresses of life, and then significant events. The second part of the workshop, though, is really, really focused on turning everybody into an advocate. So whether you're an educator, whether you're a student, obviously, I believe that advocacy piece starts first with yourself, because if you're pouring from an empty cup, it's really, really hard to give your students to what we were talking about earlier, that confidence and that agency when we don't feel good ourselves. So in the second part of the workshop, it's all about helping people learn the basic signs and symptoms of anxiety, depression, burnout, languishing, which isn't one that's talked about enough. And then those thoughts of suicide. So recognizing, okay, I'm feeling that pounding heart. I'm feeling fatigue. I'm feeling this sense of negativity towards everything. I have like this negative voice in my head towards tasks that I once enjoyed. Is this just me being lazy, or is this a sign that maybe I'm languishing or I'm experiencing burnout? So we talk about those signs and symptoms. And then the last part, which both of you have touched on, and I think it's super important, is how do we have the basic conversations around mental health so that we create psychologically safe environments where we can have productive conversations and then be able to promote help-seeking behavior, be able to build rapport with great listening skills. And then even in some cases, after that rapport has been built, if you're, a qualified individual like Susan in her particular case, she's got the training and the education to offer coping skills. And so that is what my program really focuses on. And I do believe that it's education that should be taught, like I said, K through 12. And I'm doing it really in the collegiate space right now. Another thing that I'll talk about, just touch on real quickly, which Susan was talking about with like dissociative qualities. And what I kind of forget the other one that Bruce Perry talked about. It's when the
hyperarousal. So hyperarousal and dissociative continuum, and the hyperarousal continuum.
So, and it kind of brought back some, I don't know if you all are familiar with James Clear and his book, Atomic Habits, but it kind of brought back in the cue, craving, action, reward that you were talking about, and how we want relief from those emotions. And there's a cue, and then there's the craving, like, okay, I want to relieve this feeling of stress or anxiety or whatever it might be. Then we take an action, and there's a reward at the end of that, which is that the relief of that feeling. And oftentimes we can lean on crutches like alcohol, drugs, sex addiction, things that you were touching on. And I do believe that like those life skills of teaching the youth how to build really, really sustainable, healthy habits is so important in that brain health recovery process. Because like I've seen in my own life, I have friends that they've been struggling with anxiety and depression since we were in high school. And I graduated in 2010, not to date myself too much, but, and they have,
you're a baby in this crowd, so that's good.
Fair enough. But they've created that reward system where there are certain crutches that their habits now that they've created that would take a lot of intentional work to unlearn and create new healthy habits. And so I do think that is a part of the conversation as well. That's really important. So I just wanted to touch on that, Susan, because you had brought that up. I thought that was important.
Yeah. Zach, this has been a really great conversation. I appreciate what you're naming. If people want to connect with you, how do they do that? Like, what's the best way to find Zach?
Yeah, they should just go to my website, www.zachwesterbeck.com. That's really where everything is housed. More information about my book, my speaking programs, coaching, the podcast that I'm actually going to be launching this year. All of that, the newsletter that's going to be launching this week too, where we'll be releasing a mental health tip of the week, like a inspirational quote of the week, and then a question for people to think about, something to kind of get the cognitive juices flowing, if you will.
That's really great. Well, it's been such a pleasure to have you. I'm really grateful for you to tell your story. I think it's really important for us to demystify what mental health challenges can look like. And so for you to step forward and tell your story, I just think is so important. It makes me think a lot of my friend Holmes, who I wish he had had access to this kind of information when we were in our 20s. Because perhaps you'd still be here today. So I'm just really glad you're here. I'm really grateful for the work that you're doing and for your focus on this really important age group that is going to need more help than ever as we move through the pandemic and on to the other side. So thank you, Zach, for joining us.
Yeah, and I just I wanted to highlight that statement you made, because I think it's really powerful as we head out, is that all you wanted was for someone to ask you how you are and to ask you if you were thinking about suicide. So I just want to leave on that note, because I think it's incredibly important that we encourage folks to talk about it, because talking about it doesn't make it happen. And thank you for talking about it and bringing this incredibly important topic and continuing to advocate for mental wellness.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Zach.